Hi, welcome to the DRH show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with fascinating people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. I have two very interesting guests today, because if you're listening to the podcast, you would have noticed that I'm actually one of the guests on one of their episodes. So we kind of decided to turn the table around. So I'll be the one doing the interviewing today. So today I'm joined by the hosts of Locked Up Living podcast. I'm joined by David Jones and Naomi Murphy. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting us on.
Yeah. So it's nice to just and turn the table around, like what I've said. I'll be on the side of asking you questions. So let's start off with your background. If you could just share to us how you started, and also what I'm particularly interested is, have you always been focused on well-being and resilience throughout your careers? Let's hear it first from David.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That's quite a tricky question, I think, because I've always been interested in welfare of others in a sense. And I'm also aware that as an adolescent and young man, I was pretty selfish, really. So I'm quite sure that I trod on the dreams and the well-being of others without much regard. But that's just a personal matter. I doubt if I'm alone in that, actually. But certainly since I was a late teenager, I've been interested. And at some stage, I made a decision about whether I should follow the road of anti-apartheid and join some kind of movement and become an activist there, or whether I should go into the field of homelessness. And I followed the second path and started working for a homeless shelter, first in Liverpool and then later on in Oxford. So that was a pretty challenging environment. And from there, I got into social work and worked in psychiatry for quite a long time. And then I trained as a psychotherapist and became a psychotherapist and eventually got into work in prisons. So that's me.
Thank you, David. Now let's hear it from Naomi. Is your trajectory kind of similar with David?
There are some similarities. So I think once I decided that I wanted to be a psychologist, I was obviously interested in promoting recovery from trauma and enabling people to live a more psychologically healthy life. But I think, and I've always, for the majority of my working career, I've worked with people who've committed offences and been able to see that they also have that history of trauma and need the opportunity to heal from it. But I would say that earlier on in my career, I was much more stoical and dismissive of what went on within myself in terms of emotion. And about 15 years ago, started being much more aware of actually the impact of nature, the impact of sleep, the impact of food and nutrition on us as a whole system. And then I trained as a sensory motor psychotherapist about 8 or 9 years ago, and that really boosted my interest in well-being and began taking up yoga, which prior to then I'd really not seen the point of yoga. It just seemed like stretching to me, and things like mindfulness, bioneurofeedback, all of those sorts of things knitting together, and realizing that in psychological therapies, we're often really focused on addressing deficits for people, things that are jarring in people's lives, but much less attention is given to promoting and working with things that are psychological strengths, things that enable people to make the most of the resources that are in their life. And actually, therapy doesn't have to just be about everything that's painful, but should also be about trying to capitalize on the things that feel good to people. And realizing actually people often have as much difficulty experiencing pleasurable things as they do in being overwhelmed by really powerful negative emotions.
Absolutely. Now, I'd like to flesh out more of your career, Naomi, because obviously much of what you're doing is you're creating a service for untreatable psychopaths. So what I'm interested to hear from you is, how did you come up with a solution to a problem so that other people, problems that people shied away from? What led you to create a solution for them?
Well, I think that is a good question, because and thank you for it, because the population that I've chosen to work with are a client group that people often shy away from. And I think that's largely because, and I don't think there's enough owning of this in therapists and psychologists, but largely it's because we feel inadequate or dysfunctional in terms of not being able to reach people. But I suppose a big thing for me is it's important to be able to make sense and meaning. And I guess, there are a sizable population who, certainly within the prison system, who weren't able to benefit from what was available within prison, and realizing that, actually, rather than expecting the people to change, the issue should be what is offered to them should change, and looking for meaning behind their behavior. So actually, when I see men who are behaving frighteningly with hostility and aggression, what I see is somebody who's actually quite frightened, and that's their way of protecting themselves. So that was the starting point. And then also hearing stories about the horrendous experiences of trauma and neglect during childhood, and realizing that, how can you expect people to take responsibility for their own harmful actions and to appreciate the impact they've had on others if they're not really being facilitated to be aware of their own feelings. And if you've been raised within a family where you haven't felt loved and protected and cared for, then your own capacity to experience emotion is going to be somewhat limited. So thinking that actually that needed to be the priority for treatment to start off.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to just go back to David, because we're talking about your careers, and I just want to step back a bit, because both of you have been working with the therapeutic communities, and that's also the same for David. But a lot of our listeners and a lot of people watching this, then they might not be familiar with the therapeutic community. So if you could just give us like a snapshot of what essentially is a therapeutic community, and what do you think you have learned from so many years of working with specialized services, David?
Well, to quickly sum it up, I think a therapeutic community, and they developed shortly after the Second World War as a program to support and empower men, mainly men, who returned from the war in a state of being traumatized. And they continued they still continue, obviously. But to sum it up, a therapeutic community is a deliberately designed environment which features, I would say, 4 main aspects. Communalism, that is, staff and patient/residents do things together. Decision making is shared, and we call that democratization. Permissiveness, which means that the rules are there to be negotiated. And reality confrontation, meaning that anything can be talked about and should be talked about. So difficult emotional and traumatic issues need eventually to be talked about. And that's all done within a setting of activities, daily activities, and large and small group therapy discussions. So that's basically is the structure of a therapeutic community. And they were very powerful in the NHS psychiatric hospital sector for about 25 years after the war. But now they've dined out to some extent, and prisons and children's homes and adult centres are where they're mostly found today. So, and I've learned a lot from them. In fact, I've spent most of my life in therapeutic communities, sitting in large and small groups. And I've learnt that I need to be thoughtful about what I say, be careful about how I use sarcasm, and to be humble and not to be afraid to apologize to people when you've said or done something wrong.
Thank you, David, for enlightening us how difficult it is to work with the therapeutic community. Obviously, you've got to balance challenges, and you also have to take into account the diverse range of population that you're working with. Now, what I'm interested to hear from you, Naomi and David, is obviously with years of experience working within the therapeutic landscape, you kind of get burned out. So how do you prevent your own traumatization? Because obviously you kind of you're on the receiving end of people's problems and issues. So how do you deal with that? How do you look after your own mental health and well-being?
Do you want to go first, David?
Thank you. I've just started reading Ovid with a book group that I'm a member of, and Ovid's stories focus on passion, the extremes of passion. And I've come to realize that much of our life pivots around issues of passion. So I've had some extraordinarily difficult encounters with people over my lifetime, but that's been balanced with incredibly enriched and powerful, fond relationships which have been characterized by honesty, both emotional and factual honesty. And it's that side of thing which really does outweigh the more difficult and challenging encounters that I've had that keeps me going, I think, in my day-to-day life. How about you, Naomi?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would share a lot of overlap with that. I realise that I'm quite drawn to work that involves quite strong emotions, and I enjoy that. I think that gives the kind of like vitality of life. And you're talking about honesty. I would kind of like see that my way of coping with some of the things that I've heard experienced in prisons is about emotional authenticity and actually the need to be emotionally honest and open about what I'm experiencing. And at times that's meant being connected to sadness or feelings of shame, feelings of fear, and being able to talk about those very candidly in a way that I think has been quite shocking. Certainly staff that come to our service new are always quite shocked by the openness that they will see staff on occasion crying, not in an emotionally uncontained way, but because that's the natural consequence of hearing something that's really, really sad, and being able to talk openly and honestly, which then means you don't have to take that stuff home with you at the end of the day. And I get a little bit frustrated at times when people say, oh yeah, leave my work at the gate and never think about it when I'm outside of work, but actually in work are quite dismissive of emotion, because I actually think the emotion is what we bring to our relationships with people who live in prisons, is the opportunity for them to have a very real way of relating. And I think relating to people as real human beings also helps us to sustain and be survived as well at the same time. I think, and also add in that learning for me is definitely a way of, I feel resourced by that. It helps me cope. And I think the last year during the pandemic and some other stuff that went on for me last year has been a difficult year, but actually the podcast has enabled me to have the most fantastic conversations with people that I've learned so much from. And the intellectual stimulation is definitely something that enriches me and keeps me feeling nourished and positive.
Thank you, Naomi. You actually led me to my next question, because like what David said earlier, much of our life pivots with passion, and I would hazard to say that we have a shared passion when it comes to creating online content such as podcasts. So like what I've said earlier on the introduction, you're the host of Locked Up Living podcast. So if you guys could just share to me how did you come to develop about your podcast? And I think it's also already quite apparent why did you choose your own particular niche, which is justice system. But is there any other, like sort of overarching reason why you decided to focus on that area? Let's hear it from Naomi and then.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I mean, David and I we knew of each other, but we didn't really know each other before starting the podcast. So that's been one of the things that's been really nice, to work with somebody very different, bringing different experience. But we started off by wanting to explore how people manage to stay positive and not get burnt out when in contact with the criminal justice system. And then somebody suggested to us that we perhaps should do it via a podcast. And I think we both rose to the challenge and thought it would be easier to get a conversation with somebody than to commit them to having to write something. But I think, so much of what you hear about in prisons and the criminal justice system is quite negative stuff. And I think for us, we both felt it would be really nice to be able to promote and platform some of the more positive things that happen. And I think, I'm sure I'm speaking for both of us actually, that we have managed to have conversations with some of the kindest, loveliest people during the 6 months that we've been doing the podcast. And that's not always the impression that you have from the criminal justice system. You can often find yourself jarring up against the system and in conflict. And so it's been really nice to meet with people with shared attitudes and values, and feel there's a bigger community of people that want to see positive stuff promoted in order to have a system that is more healthy.
And thank you, Naomi. That's really a lovely point. Now, I just want to ask a follow-up question to David. I'm kind of, I want to hear the same from David, but what I want David to tell us is, how does the podcast benefit your listeners, and what sort of things have you actually covered in your podcast?
Right. I'll try and remember all of that, but I'll begin by going back to the beginning, if I may, because we began because we kind of crossed paths wondering how we could help all these incarcerated people who were suddenly being locked up in their cells for 23 hours a day. And Naomi was kind enough to share with me some thoughts that she'd had, and I was able to share them across the wider TC network. But we then began to talk about the kind of places that we'd worked and the identifying features, which were things like they lasted for a long time. So Naomi's been working at the Fens for 17 years, I think. That's more or less right. And that's a very long time. Grendon has been open for 60 years. Barlini went on for 30 years or more. That was another prison TC. And the feature of these places was that they produced change for people, but they also engendered warmth and fondness. So a number of the places we were thinking of have got ongoing lives, even though they may have closed. So they now have groups of past residents and past staff, or they have exhibitions commemorating them, things like that. Whereas if you think of, Pajro, that was an old alcohol course, the numerous courses and activities that have been funneled through the prison service system, only to fold after a year or so as they were exposed as having no lasting effect. And actually, to Naomi and I, it was clear that they wouldn't have a lasting effect because they didn't introduce the idea of forming relationships and positive relationships into the work. So we thought it would be good to try and highlight those features, to identify the features in the different kind of places and programs and units across the world, actually, and to see if we could pick out and identify those highly creative features. So that's where we got to, and that's what we've been trying to do with all of our podcasts. Actually, we've been extremely fortunate, as Naomi says, in meeting with a group of people, a large group of people now, who are clearly highly dedicated to their work, extremely thoughtful and kind people. And so that's what we've been doing. And we hope that we've been able to feature different aspects, from broad programs like the Henderson Hospital to different kind of activities like a carceral archaeologist, an extremely interesting activity. So many different kinds of activities like that. And we need at some stage to try and synthesize these and elaborate a kind of overarching theory.
I think perhaps if I could just add as well, prisons and forensic environments, they often serve to keep external thinking out, so they can be a bit like a silo, and it's very hard to bring new knowledge in. And that's something I think both David and I have worked at very hard over our careers, has been to try and look outwards and bring that shared learning in. And I think that's one of the things I think people are appreciating about the podcast. Avenues they wouldn't have perhaps thought to explore, have been able to see that there's a relevance to the criminal justice system in the conversation.
And I have to say that both of you, I've listened to some of your episodes, and you're really, offering a range of guests, a range of opinions within your podcast. What I'll do is I'll put the link to your podcast in the video description notes. So for anyone who wants to listen to your podcast, they can easily follow what you're doing. But I have a very generic question to you, and I always ask this for, when I come across with people who are doing the same line of work with me, if we can call this a work. Because it's very easy to make a podcast, but what do you think makes a good podcast? Naomi?
Well, I think perhaps David hit the nail on the head earlier when he spoke about passion. I think we're both really passionate about the subject, that, it authentically fits with us and things that we're interested in. We're very, very passionate. And I feel lucky that we started this as a bit of a hobby for ourselves, a bit of a, be able to be curious, follow our interests. And actually people have come along with that and have been really interested to hear the conversations that we've been interested to hear. So yeah, I think, I suppose having a passion, being authentically interested in it. And I think, we are also talking about areas that we are ourselves knowledgeable about. So we're able to ask questions and see gaps in our knowledge base that we know that other people would also benefit from.
Absolutely. Would you like to add anything on that, David?
Well, I'm sitting here feeling rather worried at the moment because I talked about a carceral archaeologist, and of course that's total nonsense. What I was meaning was a carceral geographer, which is a somewhat different activity. And no doubt there is space somewhere for a carceral archaeologist.
I'm sure there is, David.
Thank you, David. Now, I was a guest on your podcast, and I'm really grateful that you've included me as one of your guests, and I had the opportunity to talk about resilience. Now, I'm doing a bit of research about resilience, and from what I've read, even researchers themselves, they don't seem to agree what the construct is, whether it's a trait, it's a skill, or is it a process. So I'm interested to hear from you. What's your take on resilience? What's your idea of resilience? And do you think that doing the podcast has kind of boosted your levels of resilience? David?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, isn't it? It was interesting. We were talking to Shad Maruna a few weeks back, and he was talking about desistance, and he said, well, people don't even agree about how they spell the word. Is it spelled with an E or with an A? And resilience is a bit similar in some respects, and in fact it sometimes comes under attack from people because it's viewed as a word which kind of implies that the individual carries the responsibility for their situation and for getting out of their situation, whereas I don't think that's what we mean by it. So my own particular view is that resilience is the capacity within a certain situation to use one's own internal resources to prevent oneself from being in receipt of too much psychological damage. I'm talking about psychological harm. So it's the kind of protective devices that one's able to develop as life goes on and we're able to learn and mature. How does that match with your thoughts, Naomi?
Yeah, I share that view. I see it very much as something that's in the system rather than the individual responsibility. And I suppose for us, the podcast is us contributing to discussions and debates within the wider system that can help promote things that are associated with resilience or resourcefulness and strength. And I suppose by trying to highlight, give voice to and platform areas of research or things, things that have been looked at, spoken about, studied, so that they have greater visibility, so people can become more aware of things. There are different alternatives that can be implemented. We don't have to have a system that's incredibly punitive.
Thank you. Now, I just want to explore more about your podcast. Obviously, you've taken the name from the lockdown, but I would guess that you've not really been spending the whole of your lockdown recording podcasts. So, how did you spend your lockdown during the early days, David and Naomi?
Gosh.
Well, I was going into work actually until July last year, so I didn't find I had any extra time at all, and then for various complicated reasons found myself at home, but really began to really appreciate how living in somewhere where I can get out into nature, and it gave me a lot more time to be able to really appreciate and benefit from being able to go out walking, being able to do things like yoga every single day, going running every day, practicing mindfulness every day. So I feel quite lucky and quite privileged, because I know for a lot of people, lockdown has been horrendous, or people who've found themselves having to work a lot harder. Whereas for me, it created a bit of space to be able to tend to my own physical and emotional well-being.
David?
So for me, it represented quite a change, actually, because prior to lockdown, I spent quite a lot of my time traveling the country, visiting what we call enabling environments, and these were usually they're called approved premises. They used to be called bail hostels in the old days. So these are small residential units, which usually men who have left prison go and stay there for about three months. So the occupation I had was going to these all over the country. So I went to towns that I'd never visited before in my life, wouldn't have been likely to actually, to see these approved premises and to do some sort of audit on them. Of course, that suddenly stopped, and I found that I didn't have any of that to do, but I did have quite a lot to do thinking about men in prison and in therapeutic communities in prison. So we began by trying to put together the sort of ideas that I was referring to earlier, starting to have online groups for staff and that kind of thing. But then we picked up the idea of the podcast fairly soon after that, and we spent a number of months planning it and gearing ourselves up for the terrible prospect of hearing ourselves speaking back to us repeatedly, and until we eventually launched in the beginning of January.
It's probably also worth adding that I think for anyone working at home, actually seeing people, as obviously our social contacts have diminished enormously during each of the lockdowns, and so actually being able to have interesting conversations with people, different people, because most of us made the effort to carry on doing Zooms with our family members or our loved ones, using FaceTime or WhatsApp, but actually the opportunity to network and meet new people and have interesting conversations with new people was greatly diminished, whereas this podcast enabled us to carry on doing that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you're not just really, hosting a podcast. Like what we said earlier, you're also practitioners in your own rights. You've been working with different populations. So what I'm interested to hear from you is, over the course of your career as psychotherapists, as practitioners, and I'm quite sure of this, that you've come across a number of misconceptions about psychotherapy and criminal justice system. So if you could just kind of identify those misconceptions and address them, David.
And the whole field of psychotherapy is, you're right, fraught with misunderstandings and misconceptions, and some of that it brings on itself. I think Naomi said to me a couple of weeks back that the field of psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which is where I worked, almost goes out of its way to confuse people with its complicated language and use of words. And I agree with that somehow. And so I've always tried, and increasingly, I think, as I've got older, to use simplified, straightforward language without using complicated psychological or psychoanalytic terms at all. So the idea of saying to someone, oh, this is a projective identification or something like that, or saying that to groups of staff, I wouldn't do that kind of thing at all now, because I think it just introduces a kind of barrier immediately, which then takes much longer to get around. So more and more as I've got older, I think my notion has been to become more and more of a wise simpleton. So the more simple and straightforward I can appear to my colleagues and other members of staff, the better.
I like that notion of wise simpleton, and actually, it's not just within the psychotherapeutic practice where, like what you said, there's a barrier in language, because and this is especially evident in academia, where they use like big words and jargons. When when you just scratch off the surface, you come to realize it's actually really that simple. And like what you've said, it poses as a barrier when you really use language which are highly technical. But Naomi, I just want to hear from you. Like, are there anything that you would consider misconception within criminal justice system or within psychotherapy in general?
Sure, but I just want to acknowledge that I think that David is a very humble individual, and actually he has an art of managing to make it sound like he's saying something simple when he's often talking about things that are actually quite complicated, and that is an incredibly valuable asset. But in terms of what I've observed is that it's quite common for people to say, therapists to say, you don't have to like someone to work with them. And I really refute that. I think obviously at times we encounter feelings of dislike, anger, hatred towards patients even. And I actually think all of those things can be worked with in therapy as long as you're coming from a place of wanting to like the person that you're offering that service to, and you're offering it with some integrity. You're not trying to attack the person or crush them or make them feel bad. Excuse me, sorry. And it really angers me when people say, oh, you don't have to like people to work with them, because I think actually that poor person who's receiving that therapy is getting second-rate therapy if you've got no intention of allowing yourself to have some kind of like closeness, which leads me to the next point, is that a therapeutic relationship is a real relationship. It's a different kind of relationship to the relationships that we have with our partners, our friends, our family, but it is a real relationship. And unless you're in that relationship and able to invest in it as fully as a relationship, again, I think you're doing a disservice to the person you're working with. I think I've also see that men are portrayed as being very different from women, and my experience of men in prison is they have the same traumatic histories that women in prison have. And yet whenever I've presented data on the histories of the men that I see, I'm always asked, well, how do you know they're not lying? Which I think is a question that just wouldn't be asked of women in prison. And then in prison, I think I've also been so amazed by some of the love and compassion that I see men who've committed horrendous offences, but that they've managed to extend to one another. So we run groups that run for 5 years, and at the start of treatment, the men are loners, they don't want to be in a group together. And then by year 3, they're talking about the fact that this is the first time in their lives they've ever felt loved and cared for, which is, heartbreaking, but also incredibly humbling and very, very moving to experience that. And the final 2 things that are related, I think, are that actually it's really important not to hide your fear in prison, which is totally counter prison culture, and also the importance of being emotionally open more generally in therapy. So actually speaking honestly and candidly about your experiences in relation to the individual you're working with. But that includes also, if you're experiencing the person as frightening, being able to say, actually, I'm finding you quite frightening right now. Your behaviour is quite frightening. And that allows the opportunity for change and for moving forward in a way that's quite different to what people generally get in prison.
Absolutely. And so you've talked about misconceptions. Now, what I want to hear from both of you is whether there are any trends, emerging trends in psychotherapy that you're excited about. David.
I don't know. I think we're at a very difficult time at the moment. I think if you'd asked me this question 15, 20 years ago, I'd have said, yes, there are some very exciting trends. There's an interest in working with those in our society who are presented with, inverted commas, problems, who have been problematic, be they criminals or the sort of people who turn up at our doctors' surgeries presenting with difficulties in a kind of manner that's somewhat unpalatable. There was real desire to begin to work with that kind of people. And I think there was a huge amount of money and time and effort went into that. But I think we've kind of worked through that now, and I think it's become less fashionable than it was. So although there are certain trends arising, like working relationally with people, I'm not sure that's understood now in the way that perhaps Naomi and I understood it 10 or 15 years ago. What do you think, Naomi?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's great that certainly, say, a lot of services, and including the prison service, are identifying a need to become more trauma informed. And, you know, championing that, and that's really welcome. But I have to say, if you're trauma informed, what that means is creating an environment in which people feel safe and cared for. And I'm not sure that that's always really clearly understood by people that are creating services. And I agree that there can be a bit of things can become trendy and fashionable, and then the money starts, something else jumps up the radar. So there was a big trend towards creating services for people with traumatic histories who'd been labelled as personality disordered. And I think now the latest trends are around working with people who are neuroatypical, so people with diagnoses like autistic spectrum disorder. And my fear is that will mean that money just gets shifted, rather than recognising that all of these different difficulties, you know, the people that have those problems, they're all deserving of help and treatment. I think two things I am quite excited by is certainly within therapy, rather than just within the prison system, is increasingly discussion of the role of the body in therapy, and people being much more aware of how the mind and body are related, and how we can find ways to work with people who are very traumatized without having to take them into the trauma, but instead being able to look at how that trauma is stored in their body and release that trauma in a way that I think makes therapy less traumatic for people. And the final point I'd say is about, it's great that increasingly there is an emphasis on hearing from people with lived experience, that rather than professionals, whether that be psychologists or psychotherapists or prison officers and prison governors, rather than things being done to people, that there's an increasing pressure to listen to people's experiences and hear the wisdom that they have to offer. And hopefully that will grow. I mean, that's certainly the criminal justice system is way behind other aspects of mental health, but it's been great to see that that's been speeded on, and I think that's been really helped by the work that David does with enabling environments.
Absolutely. I just want to pick on what you said about live experience, because I went to university in 1999, and when I was at university, back in the day, you don't hear the word live experience. It's what they call anecdotal evidence. And like what you've said, we've made significant progress of, taking into account the experience of people that we work with. And I think that's a good trend, like what you've said. Now, a lot of people who would be watching this interview, they're actually on the early stage of their career, or they're just considering whether they want to, be a counselor, be a psychotherapist. So, David and Naomi, would you have any recommendations in terms of sources? Let's say, for instance, book, or of course, your podcast would be a given recommendation. TED Talk that you could recommend for those, considering a career in psychotherapy.
I'm rubbish at just pulling to mind titles of things to read or do. I would say that for me, anyway, it's been a career that I've absolutely loved. I've definitely chosen the right career to do, and I think if it's something you're passionate about, then stick with that, even if you face barriers to getting on training courses. And I would say understand and read about attachment theory, because that is the crux of what can go wrong for people as well as what can go right. And the more that you understand attachment theory, the more that you will help piece things together in a way that makes sense.
David?
Yeah, I would think along similar lines, I guess, but I'd focus perhaps more on systems and understanding systems. So for me, a book I often go back to is called, it's a very old book, called Social Psychiatry in Practice by Maxwell Jones, who was one of the founders of the Therapeutic community movement in the United Kingdom. So he was a very influential figure, and his book, which was a Penguin book, is very easy to read, and I think it tackles all of the issues to do with working therapeutically in complex systems such as hospitals and certainly prisons.
Thank you. I want to follow up by asking you, who's your kind of who inspires you both professionally and personally, David?
Oh, you do come up with them, don't you, Dennis? If you'd asked me this 20 years ago, I probably would have said Bertrand Russell, but now I would be thinking much more in terms of, I can't remember his name. You'll have to come back to me about that, Dennis.
Okay, we'll hear it from Naomi.
Well, I'm going to struggle also, because I think there's so many people that I've just learnt that I think I'm a bit of a magpie, and I like to take things from different schools. And so there's things that I found really absolutely invaluable. I loved the work of, like I say, John Bowlby and attachment theory, then really got really quite taken with Jeffrey Young and schema-focused therapy. I love the work of people like Stephen Porges and Pat Ogden around how trauma is stored in the body, Peter Levine. I think anything that you find featuring Gabor Mate at the moment often includes like real words of very accessible wisdom. So I'm not really into cult following of any individual, because I think there are so many people who've got some really fantastic contributions to make, and I think look around you and try and get inspiration from as many sources as possible.
Absolutely. Now,
so if I can come back,
David.
having shoved my memory to the forefront where it belongs, I was obviously thinking of Naomi Chomsky. So he's a kind of person who I greatly admire, not just because of his work in linguistics, but because of the way in which he has tackled many of our major problems throughout the world in a steadfast manner. And secondly, I would say Melanie Klein, who I was trained as a Kleinian analyst. So I very much take her thoughts and thinking to mind, particularly about the difference between the depressive system and what we call the paranoid schizoid position. I said I wouldn't use these terms, but there I go. Poke a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and he comes out with the jargon just the same.
Okay. And what's the most important thing you want the people to know about your work? I suppose, what's the big message? Why are you doing your psychotherapy? Why are you working within the criminal justice system? And on top of that, you've got your podcast. So what's the big message from David and Naomi? Naomi first.
I suppose for me, it's been important to see fairness. And actually, I think there were so many people who've had such unfair treatment as children. And a large part of what I feel I've done during adulthood is trying to help redress that awful unfairness that they were born into and was nothing to do with them, and find ways to help them heal and have a quality of life that they have a right to, the same as the rest of us.
And for me, it would be honesty, I think. So from the first big community meeting I attended at Littlemore Hospital years and years ago, to joining the therapeutic communities at HMP Grendon, what I was really struck by was the emotional honesty of people and the capacity of that kind of setting to enable people and contain people to talk and think about things that they wouldn't otherwise have dared to.
And also, what I want to hear from you is, what's your professional dream, David, Naomi?
Oh, again, another tiny question, Dennis. I suppose at the moment we're engaged in doing some research around factors that what it's like to have strategic responsibility in services for people who've got histories of complex trauma, and I suppose I'd really like to see that come to fruition and reach an end point. That's on my immediate horizon.
Thank you for the additional moments to think about it, because I realize that one of the things I've been thinking about, certainly over the last month or so, is how to bring together the many strands that Naomi and I have encountered over the past months. Because what I think is most beneficial to all systems, certainly for the prison system, is to have a kind of culture of multidisciplinary thinking. And I think we're a long way from having that, particularly in our prison service and the forensic psychology service, packed with very, very clever, thoughtful and kind people though it is. It lacks a kind of multidisciplinary approach, and I'd like to see us really tackle that head on and make some progress with it.
And do keep us updated how your research, how your projects pan out in the future. And also, Naomi and David, what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a psychologist or as a psychotherapist?
Well, I do often think about that, actually. I would love to work in an opera company. I'm totally incompetent at doing anything practical to a high degree, but just hiding away in the background, banging pieces of wood together, screwing a scene structure together. I'd love to be involved with that kind of stuff.
Naomi?
I'm not sure. I actually feel I do what I feel passionate about. Mm-hmm. So I don't really daydream about having another career. Maybe sometimes I think about kind of like filmmaking, but even that doesn't feel that far removed from what I do, which is help people tell their stories and in a way that has some coherence.
Thank you. And finally, what else is in the pipeline? And if people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at? And of course, do remind us about your podcast and how often do you do your recording? Naomi.
Okay, so the podcast is called Locked Up Living, and it's available on all platforms with a focus on boosting wellbeing and resilience. We're both quite active on Twitter. I'm on as NM Psychologist. I'm sure David will share his in a moment. And I think for us, we need to kind of like plan and think about what we do next to harness some of the energy that we've created through the podcast. I think we've both been quite surprised by how popular it's been, and wanting to make sure we maximise the energy from that, really.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Naomi's right that we started with the outline of an idea, and we've followed up many strands which relate to that kind of core idea. And I think we're at the point where we can begin to bring some of those things together and synthesize them into our thinking a bit more than we have done so far, perhaps.
Thank you. David Jones and Naomi Murphy, it's a pleasure having you here on the DRH show. Yeah, it's nice to be on the other side of the table, but unfortunately our time is up. Thank you for sharing to me your journey and of course, about talking about your podcast. I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thanks so much for such a warm welcome, Dennis. Thanks for having us on.